Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello and welcome to Now Where Were We, an ongoing series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. I'm Deborah Ross, and today we are continuing with the series that I've been calling By the Decades. In each episode we feature one decade of our area's history, and we are now up to the 1930s. I'm on the shores of Capitol Lake near downtown Olympia. This area would have looked very different in the 1930s from the way it does now. Today, on a nice day, the pathway around the lake is filled with pedestrians, strollers, dogs, and bicyclists. In order to start talking about what this area looked like in the 1930s, though, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. The 1879 bird's eye view of Olympia shows that the Deschutes Estuary lapped up against the back doors of the homes and businesses of Capitol Way, then called Main Street. Over a period of a couple of decades, fill was added to the shores of the estuary, creating Columbia Street and then Water Street. And that flatland was for several years not used for any kind of industrial or commercial or residential activity. The railroad came in the later part of the 19th century. Sometime in the early 20th century, there began to appear a set of float houses and what were called shanties in the area. Float houses have existed in this area ever since the very beginning and probably before Europeans arrived. They were homes that were built on top of rafts and would rise and fall with the tides. And they, of course, continue to exist here in the form of the houseboats that line Budd Inlet as well. Shanties was the name given to homemade residential structures that were the precursors of mobile homes of the time. They were built and erected and very likely had limited infrastructure in the form of running water or any other kind of facilities. It's possible that one of the reasons why the float houses and shanties began to be erected in this area was that it was shortly after the clearance of the red light district, or the dead zone, which was just north of here and which we've covered in previous episodes. By the 1930 census, there were about 40 structures here, and they were occupied by single men and a few families. Almost all of the households had at least one wage earner. They worked for lumber mills, for the early veneer companies, for commercial businesses in downtown Olympia. And there were, of course, a few households that did not have wage earners. There was at least one blind person here and several elderly people as well. So that by the 1920s and early 1930s, this was already a well-established small community at the edge of downtown Olympia. And then the Depression hit. By the middle of the 1930s, this area had at least 100 and perhaps more residential structures located in the stretch of the Deschutes Estuary that ran between 4th Avenue and the train station at the foot of the hill that rises up to Capitol Campus. And in 1936 was the first mention that I've seen of the term Little Hollywood. It's not clear where the name Little Hollywood came from, but there was a Hollywood on the Flats that was a much larger community in Tacoma, and so it's possible the term Little Hollywood was just a way of Olympia referring to the fact that we had what they called a shanty town that was similar in scope and structure but much smaller than Tacoma's. Much more demographic work needs to be done about the people who lived in Little Hollywood. Of course, given that the structures were often makeshift, mobile, with a mobile community, it may be difficult to nail down exactly who was living here and how many people were engaged in employment in the area, how many were unable to obtain employment during those years of the Depression in the 1930s. Some contemporary and later references to Little Hollywood call it a Hooverville or a Hoboville, referring to the fact that it existed during the Depression years. In fact, as we know, there was settlement here as early as the early part of the 20th century. There was a blacksmith shop and a beauty shop and other commercial establishments that served the needs of Little Hollywood residents. The newspapers, of course, reported on less savory aspects of the community, knife fights, alcoholism, some bootlegging during the Prohibition years. And those are the articles, of course, that drew the attention of the powers that be in Olympia, so that by the mid-30s there was talk about clearing out Little Hollywood. At that point, a group of union representatives, as well as some local citizens, protested that it would be unfair to kick out the residents of Little Hollywood without finding alternative accommodation for them. A sentiment that may ring true to those people who are thinking about and concerned with the homelessness issues that's now facing downtown Olympia. And so the decision was made that Little Hollywood would be eliminated, but it would be done in a gradual basis. It took over 4 years for alternative accommodations to be found for the citizens of Little Hollywood. But in 1941, the last residents were finally moved out, and in April of 1941, all the remaining structures of Little Hollywood were put to the torch. One of the ironies for me is that the mayor at the time of the torching was Truman Trullinger. If the name Trullinger is at all familiar to longtime viewers of this program, it's that Truman Trullinger was a doorstep baby. He had been abandoned by his mother on a doorstep when she was looking desperately for a better home for her son. At the time, she was likely living in the red light district.